I have the great privilege and honor to be with Sara Robertson today. How are you?
I'm good, Sai. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. The pleasure and honor is all ours. So, I know I stumbled upon your writing, "Anti-Fragile is the New Resilient," and was completely captivated by the way that you describe things and share. So, please, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, and we can dive right in.
Right. Well, as you said, I'm Sara Robertson, and I'm a human being. So we'll start with that. Things that I do. I founded a business called Lime Horse, and that focuses on e-learning for continuing professional development, specifically for legal professionals at this point in time. I'm also a faculty and advisory board member of the AMM Mind program at University of Toronto. I sit on a committee with the Mindfulness in Law Society, which is based mostly in the U.S. And I consult with another organization as Mindful Gateway Consulting, and then I don't know, I've got a few other little things going on here and there that kind of go, but that's probably, I mean, the core of what I'm up to lately.
Wonderful, wonderful. So definitely, you know the narrative of the event that's forthcoming and the different themes, and would love to kind of get your perspective and thoughts around all of that.
Yeah, I mean, when you and I started talking, I think the part that really stood out for me that was important is, when we talk about future ready or future proofing businesses, and, we're moving into like this real digital transformation that's happening with, all of the different events that are going on around the world. I mean, the pandemic's an obvious one. There's lots of other, civil and civic things happening in different areas as well that are coming up as a result of that. And so, I mean, my focus in my work is primarily on sort of the personal development space and how that improves both individuals' experience, but then organizations as well. Like, I'm a very, very strong believer that you need to start with the person. It's challenging to have functioning organizations or institutions when we have a society that sort of either directly or indirectly creates unhealthy adaptive functioning in workplaces and that sort of thing. Like, I really do believe that if we have, we focus on having healthier individuals, that's going to sort of, translate up into healthier organizations and structures.
And Sara, that really captured me when I looked at some of your writing and things. The essence of life being uncertain, and then anti-fragility being an antidote to that, and specifically in this case, starting with the individual, and really there are things that the individual needs to embrace in order to have that broader impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the things where we've kind of driven a bit more towards, I think, in our society is on a very sort of instant gratification, short-term outlook, and a lot of sort of a more external locus of control. So we are looking for, outside things to meet their needs. And it's inherently anti-fragile because you're looking at the effects. Of course, the world has always been, it is uncertain. I mean, if you've been in any sort of business development, you're going to have heard the acronym VUCA, which is, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that's the world that we live in. We do need to have, certain sort of heuristics and different patterns that allow us to, organize the uncertainty of the world in a way that allows us to function. That I think we've driven a little bit too far towards looking at the external as an indicator of, our success, as opposed to really, when you get into being anti-fragile, is I think you're really flipping that into looking at success more as sort of a internal or a holistic foundation that drives that. If that makes sense.
Most definitely, most definitely, because it's very much a holistic viewpoint versus an external viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the there's a few things that really captured my attention again with your expression of the concepts and what have you. And one of them in particular, there's a sentence that really grabbed me, and I highlighted it. You know, you indicate we have been, you know, conditioned to believe, you know, pain, failure, tension, stress, and disorder are bad and should be avoided, when the reality is these are really opportunities for growth.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that really captured me in your expression.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a part of it I think that's conditioned, and there's a part of it I think that's like inherent about being, you know, a human being as well. Like down to, you know, our core part of why we, you know, evolved to the place that we are is because we were, you know, a bunch of anxious apes, you know, looking around for, you know, ways to deal with, you know, mitigate the uncertainty and the risk that was happening. Um, and so I think like there's always going to be a part, there is a function of our instinct that is going to be sort of looking for comfort and risk averse. And then this is where I'm saying the conditioned part is, I think we've gotten more and more into sort of this idea that that being successful or functioning well means that we're comfortable all the time. And I think that the message there is misguided, if not damaging at
Mhm.
times. And like if you look at a good example of this is, because I think we forget what it's like to learn when we become adults. And if you want to look at development in children, I mean, the difference between, you know, a child who is given an opportunity to, you know, explore in a measured way, to challenge themselves, to try different things, to fail frequently. I think being able to fail frequently in an environment where failure is seen as a, you know, a function of effort or willingness and trying rather than you know, a shame-based situation. I mean, those are the, you know, kids that you see that become, you know, more adaptable and, you know, more resilient and anti-fragile with you. And you can look at, I'm sure that, you know, many people would look at examples of, you know, kids that maybe, you know, were overly sheltered, and in the effort into protecting them from, you know, all failure ends up creating these incredibly, you know, fragile individuals because they don't know how to handle challenge. They don't know how to be with uncertainty. I think that that'll get to the point where I think like one of the foundational things in becoming an anti-fragile individual is just in the ability to be uncomfortable.
Mhm. I think that's very powerful because, and I love the way you expressed it. We have come to associate normality with functioning well with comfort, when the reality is it's always been uncertain. We've just conditioned ourselves to embrace that perspective. There's a
Mm-hmm.
there's another sentence which really again captured my attention in your writing. You know, you indicate it may sound counterintuitive to look for opportunities to expose yourself to stress, but the truth is humans need it to grow. And, you know, how have you kind of helped instantiate that with your world and your business and everything you do?
Um, well, I mean, I've had some situations in my life come up where I've sort of been, you know, forced not maybe as a product of some of my decisions, but not directly of my choosing to be uncomfortable. I've changed careers twice so far in my life. I mean, I'm 40 years old, so usually people don't drastically change careers twice by that age. And a few different things, you know, had come up, and the last time I burnt out at my job, and I think and I became really aware of what I needed to do in order to create an environment where I was going to be able to not only face the challenges that were presented with me, but be able to thrive as well. And so, I mean, I have a, you know, some of my background and training is in mindfulness, and I know mindfulness is a little bit of a you know, a buzzword and has been for a while, and often that's attributed to, you know, areas of like reducing stress and stress management. But when you get a little bit deeper into understanding what, you know, mindfulness practice or mindset is, it's a lot more about being able to sort of remove ego and over identification, personalization with things, which I think really contribute to being more fragile as an individual too. And that's why when we started off talking, I said, look, like I'm a human being and here are the things that I do. And the reason why I think that's important is because the things that I do may change. So I like to have them like that's separate. I'm passionate about it, but it's not my person. I think it becomes um, it can create fragility when there's over identification with the roles that you're in, both for individuals and for organizations as a whole, because generally, like we talked about, the fear and pain and that sort of thing. And when you have a situation where, your ego or identity is being threatened, then that tends to create, a lot of tunnel vision. That's where you get much more siloed approaches to things. People trying to kind of like protect their sort of tribe, that little chiefdoms that show up. And that's because when you get into a place where you're overly identified with what you do, then anything that presents risk to that is inherently something to be avoided.
Mhm. It's very powerful. Sarah, your introduction and when I asked you, can you introduce yourself, was perfect. It was absolutely brilliant, because it was to the core essence of you have to be human in order to be able to capitalize on our humanity, and at the same time confront and pierce through our fears, quite honestly. And I think a lot of people avoid that in so many ways in modern life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's always like having an anti-fragile sort of outlook is being able to, like I said, look at things like there is, the job or the position or the action or the activity, and then there is the person. And what that creates is an ability to kind of have more of a separation, have a meta awareness of what's happening. And I think when people can look at, you can create a culture, an environment that sort of embraces people challenging themselves or not being afraid to fail, is when you can separate the behaviors or the actions or products or anything from like the core individual themselves. I think we see a lot of this happening when we get into looking for assigning. I think people need to be responsible and accountable for their actions to the degree that those are their actions. But when you come as training people, taking responsibility for things is a way to assign, blame or consequence, that creates fragility, because people aren't going to be open and collaborative. Like we want to be solutions focused and people focused. And, how do we create a space where, people aren't afraid to, to show up and bring themselves to their work without having to worry about their, unnecessarily their livelihood being threatened. That that makes sense as well, I hope.
Most definitely, most definitely. I have sort of two thoughts, and I'd love your perspective is on this particular question, and then I have another question. But the first one is, I've often said that one of the most personal questions that you can ever ask someone is very directly, who are you? And because it pierces directly to the identity aspect of it. Any thoughts relative to that from your experience and from kind of the things that you've worked with?
Who are you? Wow, um, that is one hell of a question, Sai. Yeah, because it's interesting, because I'm going to say like, who are you? And I'm going to say, oh, I'm Sara Robertson, and
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about a lot of things that I do. But I think that that's part of it too, is trying to answer that question. I don't know that I can,
Yeah.
because I am, as a person, I'm constantly evolving. And even to say like, who are you? And for me to say, oh, I'm a human being. I mean, that's what I am in the body, and I
Yes.
inhabit. But that,
And
who are you? It's a huge question.
most definitely,
I don't know. I don't know that I have
most
an answer for you.
exactly, and most definitely, I'm asking it not directly to you, but rather that I'm asking your perspective on that power of that question, which is, I think,
Yeah.
exactly as you've shared.
Yeah. And I think it's like that's, we have this existential question where people are like, oh, I need to figure out who I am. And it's like, do you need to figure out who you are? Just need to be who you are in that moment and move forward and let that unfold.
It's beautiful. That's beautiful, because it's very powerful, because at that point, it's no longer a question of who are you, but it's a question of who do you need to be in the moment. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
very powerful.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
so my sort of next question is, as again, I really have a tremendous amount of respect for your perspective. absolutely tremendous. And the way you express it, etc. If you look at kind of what's happening in the world, what kind of advice can you offer leaders from any vantage point and people out there that are struggling to make sense of reality?
Um, I think that sense making is challenging, and that can be where we end up with when you talked a little bit about heuristics and that and the different types of models that we use to make sense of a complex world is challenging, because it can both be something that really helps us organize information and operate, and then it can be the thing that actually drives bias. So my tips, or if you wanted any advice, would be to look for opportunities or maybe areas where you're turning away from discomfort, and not necessarily trying to you don't even necessarily have to embrace it, but just trying to let things that are maybe uncomfortable or outside of your control just be for that that period of time, to practice not always trying to have a solution or having an answer, to be in a position where an openness to letting things unfold. And one of the practices that I always try to have is to approach with curiosity, and from I'll look at something and I'll be like, well, let's see, let's try this out as an experiment. And I think when you approach with, you can't be curious and judgmental at the same time.
Right.
So an antidote to fear and judgment is really curiosity. Ask a lot of questions, and asking questions without necessarily needing to be immediately seeking an answer is a really a good tool to have. Another one, if you're looking for like leaders or organizations, is like looking at opportunities to create a growth positive environment. Like, how is your communication? What is your culture like? Is there a attitude of failure being an opportunity for learning? Do you have that in your organization? Because I think sometimes organizations think that they think that they have that, and they don't. So there's, I think, opportunity there. And then the other one would be to look at personal autonomy. I think is really important too. Being able to be equally, I mean, people I think want to be able to make their own decisions, but being able to be autonomous also means being held account to those decisions too. And some of that is going to require, again, being able to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Very well said. And I have to share with you, there's, from the minute I read your writing and from the conversation, it really emphasizes to me how much you embrace an empowerment vantage point, not a victim vantage point.
Mm-hmm.
And you encourage it. And it comes off in the conversation tremendously. So I do truly appreciate that, Sara.
Yeah, thank you. I think, and I think that's the thing, like having being able to maintain as much personal agency, and even for things like when you're outside of things that are outside of your control. I mean, you will always have agency over your perspective.
Very well said.
But at the very least, you have power over how you look at a situation.
Very well said. Any closing thoughts at all, Sara?
Oh my gosh. I mean, we've talked about so much so far. I've really appreciated this. I really enjoyed, I listened to a few of the other talks that you had, and I really appreciated the perspectives that some of the other individuals had too. I guess, when we look at solutions moving forward, I know as we talked, there's a lot of digital transformation happening. There's going to be upheavals in business on how they operate from a technological standpoint. I think keeping in mind, though, that for all of our advances in technology, the one thing that technology isn't going to be able to replace is our humanness.
Yeah.
So that to maintain that is one of the core values, as in an individual or an organization or an institution, is that we're looking for technology to be serving or augmenting our humanness, and not to be a replacement for it. I think would be probably the most important closing message that I would have.
Wonderful. Words of wisdom. I hope we stay in contact, and likewise get an opportunity to converse more in the future.
Great. That's great. Thank you again so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Sara.